It's late afternoon in England, that quiet hour when the kettle begins to hiss, scones are laid out, and the table becomes a small sanctuary from the day. Tea time. It's a ritual so ordinary now that it feels timeless, woven into the fabric of British life. But beneath this gentle pause lies a story that is anything but gentle. Why do the English drink tea at all? And how did a plant that once grew only in the garden mountains of China become the centerpiece of Britain's daily rhythm? Welcome to Botanical Echoes, a podcast about the myth, lore, and history surrounding plants. I'm Caleb, your host. There are a few things I would like to note before I continue the episode. This will be my first multi-part episode. I do not know how many episodes it will be split into, but it does contain a lot of information for one episode. So in order for everyone to not drown in the information, and for me to keep my voice, it will be broken up. I also want to acknowledge something important. Some of the language and attitudes quoted in this episode reflect the racial biases of the 19th century. These are not my views. They are the documented words of the people involved, and I include them only to understand the world in which this story unfolded. With that in mind, let's look at the plant that started it all. Camellia sinensis, the plant behind every cup of tea, has been revered in China for thousands of years, celebrated for its healing and sustaining properties. It was once said that a Chinese never drinks cold water, which he abhors and considers unhealthy. England, however, approached tea differently. The English didn't drink it for health. They softened its bitterness with sugar and milk, turning it into comfort rather than medicine. Tea first arrived in England in the 1650s through Portuguese and Dutch traders. From there, it slipped into London's coffee houses, and later into the royal court, where Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese wife of King Charles II, made it fashionable among the elite, and once the elite embraced it, everyone else followed. By the 1700s and 1800s, tea had become a national habit. Today, the United Kingdom is one of the world's top tea consuming nations, drinking around 36 billion cups a year. Think about that for a minute. That's 100 million cups every day. That's a lot of tea. And this newfound love plants its base for gluttony. China had a monopoly on tea and traded it with England, while England had a monopoly on opium and traded it with China. These trades mutually benefited each country, essentially funding each other's addictions. But in 1729, the Yongzheng Emperor issued the first imperial ban on the sale of opium and the operation of opium smoking houses. It was an early attempt to curb a growing problem, but it barely slowed the trade. Opium continued to pour into China, smuggled in by foreign merchants, and Britain's profits only grew. Within a few decades, opium imports had multiplied fivefold. By the 1830s, the crisis could no longer be ignored. The Yongzheng Emperor sent Commissioner Lin Zexu to Canton with a clear mission: end the opium trade once and for all. Lin surrounded the foreign factories, the trading compounds where British merchants lived and worked, and refused to let anyone leave until every last chest of opium was surrendered. Nearly 300 foreigners were confined inside. Supplies were cut off, tensions thickened in the humid Canton air, and under pressure, the British finally handed over more than 20,000 chests of opium, about $6 million worth at the time, and roughly 145 million in today's money. Lin ordered it all destroyed, dumping the opium into the Pearl River in a dramatic act of defiance. China called it justice. Britain called it an attack on their property. They demanded compensation, and when none came, the Opium War began. It was a short, brutal conflict. China's wooden junks, flat-bottomed sailing vessels built for rivers and coastal waters, were no match for Britain's steam-powered warships. And by the end, Britain won, forcing open 5 ports that had been closed to the west for nearly 2 centuries. Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai. The victory thrilled some in London. New markets, new access, and new power. But others saw the danger. What if China retaliated? What if they legalized domestic opium production and cut Britain out entirely? And beneath all of this ran a quieter fear. Even with new ports open, China still controlled a large portion of Britain's economy. The tea, the plant itself, the knowledge, the cultivation, and the processing, all of it remained locked behind China's borders. But this victory didn't just bring in trade, it fed a growing fire back home. You see, during the reign of Queen Victoria, England was gripped by an insatiable desire for unusual plants. Everyone wanted something rare. Walking down a London street, you'd see ferns pressed against every window pane, hear gossip about a $12,000 moth orchid, or glimpse a private menagerie overflowing with exotic specimens. Plants were no longer just decorations. They were status, identity, and obsession. And the people who tended them, once humble gardeners, were suddenly elevated to a near mythic status. They were the ones with the knowledge, the hands, and the patience to coax life from the foreign soil. They became explorers, collectors, and sometimes adventurers, dispatched across the globe to bring back wonders no English eye had ever seen. China, meanwhile, remained a land of rumor and imagination. Stories flourished of dragons, hidden valleys, impossible flowers, and dangers lurking in mist-covered mountains. It was a botanical gold rush, but instead of one place to be searched, the entire world became the frontier. Out of this feverish atmosphere grew a constellation of horticultural societies, each vying for prestige, the most influential being the Royal Horticultural Society of Chiswick, founded in 1804 by John Wedgwood, the maternal uncle of Charles Darwin. It became the arbiter of taste, the keeper of botanical attention, and the place where reputations were made. And among its rising stars was Robert Fortune, a man of modest beginnings. Fortune learned horticulture from his father, a hired farmhand. He had no formal education beyond his schooling outside the small Scottish parish of Edrom, yet he possessed an uncanny talent for cultivating orchids and rare showy plants. His skill and his quiet determination propelled him quickly through the ranks of England's most respected horticulturalists. When the First Opium War ended and new Chinese ports opened to foreigners, the Royal Horticultural Society saw an opportunity no foreigner had enjoyed since the days of Marco Polo: legal access to the plants of China. They wanted someone who could travel through these newly opened regions, collect specimens, and bring back botanical treasures for the English gardens. And among all their members, Robert Fortune, with his expertise, grit, and curiosity, was the obvious choice. Fortune became the first person granted official leave by the Foreign Office to spend 3 years exploring the flora of China. His wages were modest, £100 a year, about $5,000 in today's money, and he was initially forbidden to carry any weapons. He protested, arguing that the journey would be dangerous, and eventually won permission to bring a firearm. The society agreed that the entire expedition would be jeopardized if their adventurer were killed before it even began. Their confidence in him would prove well placed. Fortune wrote frequent reports, shipped home crates of living plants, and documented everything he saw. Over the course of 3 years, he introduced the winter blooming jasmine, the bleeding heart, and the double yellow tea rose, a flower that would later bear his name, Fortune's Double Yellow. His journey began in Hong Kong. Newly ceded to Britain, he found it in lamentable condition, declaring it unsuitable for trade, a judgment history would prove spectacularly wrong. From there, he traveled north toward Shanghai, nearly losing his life in a typhoon. He later wrote, "Some idea may be formed of the storm when I mentioned that a large fish, weighing at least 30 pounds, was thrown out of the sea onto my skylight upon the poop. The frame was dashed to pieces, and the fish fell through and landed upon the cabin table." China was not gentle with him. While hunting for plants, he was pickpocketed, beaten, chased, and struck in the head with a brick by thieves. Stunned, he leaned against a wall to catch his breath, only to be surrounded and relieved of several belongings. In order to enter the famed gardens of Suzhou, he resorted to a disguise. He shaved his head, donned Chinese clothing, and wore a wig with a long braided tail, also known as a queue. The transformation was convincing enough to fool the gatekeepers. Throughout this first mission, Fortune carried a sense of Western superiority. He described the countryside as wretched Chinese hovels, cotton fields, and tombs, mocking any notion of Chinese refinement. But 3 years in the foreign land changed him. He came to rely entirely on the people around him: peasants, boatmen, coolies, guides, and porters. Slowly his views softened. He began to imagine a future in which the two nations might understand one another, writing that nothing can give the Chinese a higher idea of our civilization and attainments than our love for flowers, or 10 more to create a feeling between us and them. On his journey home, that fragile hope was nearly cut short. Fortune was lying in his cabin when the captain burst in shouting, "Pirates!" Chaos erupted on deck. The captain tore up floorboards to hide valuables, while the crew scattered in panic. As the first pirate ship approached, its crew began to holler. When Fortune looked back at his own men, they had transformed themselves into filthy beggars, wearing torn rags and rice sacks. Their small cargo junk was hopelessly outmatched, outgunned, outmanned, and far too slow to outrun pirate vessels. The crew hauled up baskets of rocks from the hull. They dumped them on the deck to use as weapons. Everyone was shouting. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to flee into the cliffs. Fortune, fearing that a Westerner would be a valuable prize, grabbed his rifle, pointed it at his own helmsman, and said, "My gun is nearer to you than those of the pirates, and if you move from the helm, depend on it, I will shoot you." Just then a cannonball screamed overhead. Every man but Fortune and the pilot fled below deck. The pirates opened fire. Fortune made a decision. He would make his ship look easy to board, luring the pirates in close. He knew their cannons and locally made muskets were no match for his British rifle, engineered for precision. The plan was working. As the pirate ship closed in on 20 yards, Fortune fired both barrels. The enemy crew vanished behind their ship walls, their sail luffing helplessly. His shot had struck true, perhaps killing or injuring the helmsman, but the ship was suddenly unmanned. He hoped that would be the end of it. But his hopes were soon dashed when another pirate ship appeared, with 3 more off in the distance. Time was running out. Inspired by his crew's earlier disguise, Fortune rushed below deck, grabbed a trunk of his Western clothing, and dressed the least Chinese-looking Chinamen among the crew in coats and hats, arming them with sticks to mimic rifles. If they looked like Europeans, perhaps the pirates would hesitate. They did not. The second ship opened fire, and the crew once again bolted below deck, leaving Fortune alone. Before the pirates could reload, he stood, rifle in hand, and fired 2 shots. Then he drew his revolvers and emptied both into the approaching vessel, killing the helmsman, leaving the second ship unmanned as well. On the horizon, the remaining pirate ships turned and fled. Fortune wrote, "A stranger who had not seen these gentry before would have supposed them to be the bravest men in existence." 2 years after returning to England, Fortune published his accounts in 1847 in his book 3 Years' Wandering in the Northern Provinces of China. The book was a sensation among botanists and scholars, and once news of the pirate attack spread, it cemented his reputation as a seasoned China hand, a man who could survive storms, thieves, disguises, and pirates, a man who could go where others could not. Meanwhile, the East India Company was facing a crisis of its own making. For decades, the company had been the middleman in one of the most profitable and destructive trade loops in the world. They grew poppies in India, processed the opium, smuggled it into China, used the profits to buy tea, and then sold that tea to Britain. They controlled both ends of the addiction: opium for China, tea for Britain. It was a financial engine unlike anything else in the 19th century. But after the Opium War, the balance shattered. China's crackdown on opium had destabilized the trade long before the war began, and even though Britain won militarily, the company lost something far more important: its monopoly and its predictability. The opium pipeline was no longer reliable. One of the biggest revenue streams was drying up. Tea, however, remained as essential as ever. Britain's demand only grew, and the company depended on Chinese tea to keep its profits afloat. But tea was a secret China guarded fiercely. Foreigners were confined to a handful of ports, and the tea plantations lay deep in the mountains, far beyond western reach. The cultivation, the processing, the tools, and the workers, all of it was protected knowledge. The East India Company was beginning to feel the sting of its shrinking income, and in their desperation, a new idea took hold. They would no longer be just a tea distributor, they would become a tea producer. And they knew they could grow tea in the jungles of Assam, on land the company controlled. British surveyors discovered native tea plants growing wild. They even planted tea seeds imported from China in the same region, and they thrived in the climate. The soil, the rainfall, the elevation, everything matched the tea growing provinces of China. But when they harvested the leaves and presented the results to England's best tea tasters, the verdict was unanimous. The tea was harsh, too strong and sooty, a crude imitation of the smooth, layered flavors that came from China's mountains. The problem was suddenly, painfully clear. If they had the plants, then what they lacked was the knowledge. And if they wanted that knowledge, there was only one place they knew they could find it: China. Thank you for joining me on Botanical Echoes. In the next episode, we follow the plan that took shape in London, a plan that would send one man into a forbidden country to steal an empire's most guarded secrets. If you hear any echoes of your own, questions, reflections, or stories, send them my way at botanicalechoes@gmail.com.